Thank you for joining us. One of the most important issues of concern throughout history is that of racial discrimination and civil rights. The foremost leader in this cause was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man of God and a visionary who was subjected to illegitimate government persecution and was arrested in the past for doing precisely what he's now celebrated and honored for. Not only is he remembered as a powerful voice for civil rights, but for Jewish people as well. Dr. King was a uniquely important ally in the fight against anti-Semitism and for a secure Israel. In fact, Jewish people marched arm in arm with him in Selma, Alabama, back in 1965. One issue that Dr. King was particularly concerned with was the growing mischaracterization of Zionism as racism. Today, we'll meet the author of the book King Rules, written by Dr. Alveda King, the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., following these messages.
The mission of the Life Extension Foundation is to support scientific research and to gather and disseminate information related to the delay and eventual elimination of disease, aging, and premature death. The Foundation is careful to commit its research dollars to projects that are difficult or impossible to fund with government dollars, institutional grants, or through other funding sources. It is essential to make anti-aging research a priority today to prevent a healthcare catastrophe caused by aging baby boomers overwhelming our healthcare systems.
Human age reversal. We may be there already. Human studies are now ready to begin to confirm meaningful reversal of pathological aging processes. These clinical trials aim to alter older humans so that they function as much younger individuals. Even modest success will result in a paradigm shift that will impart enormous societal benefits, such as sparing Medicare from insolvency. Life extension is not standing idle while 5,000 Americans die each day from age-related illnesses. Joining us are physician scientists who want to hurry up these technologies to keep people from aging to death. While life extension is pushing these projects forward, we need financial help to ensure these studies are carried through to fruition.
Find magic again. Sprout by HP. With Intel RealSense technology inside, now you can bend the rules of creativity outside.
On April the 5th, 1968, the body of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began its journey home to Atlanta. Since his passing away, Dr. Martin Luther King has become the symbol and the embodiment of the civil rights movement. In 12 years, his leadership began the process of ending the system of segregation that was a shameful part of American history for over a century. His commitment and courage continues to inspire people across the entire world. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta at 501 Auburn Avenue on January 15, 1929. He was born in the Old South, in the heart of a thriving black community. He grew up in a divided world in which people knew their place and stayed there.
in many of the stores downtown, I could not go to a lunch counter to buy a hamburger or a cup of coffee. There was a very strict system of segregation, and there was nothing called racial integration at that time in Atlanta.
Dr. King spent his youth in this house, in an atmosphere of comfort and privilege. He was a sensitive and articulate child, with a passion for big words, and was quite able to talk himself out of any situation. Like many in Atlanta's middle class, money and status insulated him from the petty indignities of racial segregation. Dr. King's parents were beacons of this proud community, and his father was regarded as one of its leaders.
His father was a very powerful minister of the church in Atlanta. He was economically, he wasn't vastly wealthy, but he was certainly economically very secure. On a comparative basis to other black folk, he would be considered wealthy.
The childhood of his father, raised in the South, could not have been more different. His father was poor and illiterate. He was principled but unpolished, and then his father walked all the way to Atlanta and educated himself. Dr. King's father then married into one of the city's most powerful black communities.
The Kings were a very respectable family.
On a gray December morning in 1956, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. boarded the first of one of the newly integrated buses, and he took a seat where he wanted to. America would never be the same, and gave Martin his first victory. But it would also bring unforeseen complications, because he was now symbolized as a new kind of black man, and television would keep him in the public eye.
Suppose we begin this discussion by first asking you, Dr. King, in your estimation, what and who is this new Negro?
The new Negro is a person with a new sense of dignity and destiny, with a new self-respect. Along with that is this lack of fear which once characterized the Negro, this willingness to stand up courageously.
His new media profile brought him sympathetic listeners in powerful places, but segregation remained intact across the South.
He traveled the nation speaking about the successes of the bus boycott and hoping to find something that would suggest a breakthrough. However, segregationists were not the only ones threatened by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach.
Roy Wilkins, as executive secretary of the NAACP, not only perceived King's organization as a potential threat to the NAACP's role in the South, he also, perhaps inevitably, came to perceive King as a potential competitor, potential rival for personal stature within Black America.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. When we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
This was the moment for which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would be remembered forever. The finest example of his powers as a public speaker and preacher, as a leader and visionary. On that day in August, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reached the peak of his popularity.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The day after this speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and murdered at this motel. And over the years, layers of mystery and conjecture would settle upon this horrific moment. Reviled by many at the time of his death, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has become a national hero, the great martyr of the civil rights movement. His every insight has acquired the weight of truth with the passing of time. His every fear has come to pass as well. He asked America to live up to its ideals. He died for a dream to which this nation still aspires. With us now is Dr. Alveda King. Such a pleasure, privilege, and honor to be with you here today.
It is wonderful to join you, Richard.
Thank you. I'm so much in admiration of what you and your family represent. And in fact, right here on the table, I have this magazine. I'd like you to look at the title. My friend wrote this article. He asked me to give you this. How government persecuted those we now honor. How they persecuted people like Dr. Martin Luther King, who is now honored. So there's so much of that goes on. And I'd like you to share, first of all, this is from Bill Falloon to you. I'd like you to have it.
Thank you.
He also asked me, he wrote this book, he asked me to give it to you, this book, Pharmocracy, about the questionable things that occur in that world. But anyway, I'd like to give it to you on behalf of my friend Bill.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to ask you about the persecution your uncle was subjected to, just because he believed in these immense essential values.
When my uncle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was living, of course, I was born in 1951. So in the 1950s, I was relatively young. I became a teenage girl in the 1960s, and I could understand very clearly the fight and the struggles that he was having, fighting for the opportunity for all Americans to have the right to vote here in America, regardless of the color of our skin. It was one of those. He was very concerned about the war in Vietnam. And when my uncle began to touch on the economic imbalance in our nation, that is when the accolades became severe persecution. And that type of persecution, of course, finally ended up in his demise. He was killed in 1968. And so we began to realize over a period of years how it was okay if he preached a good sermon as a Christian man, a Baptist preacher. But if he began to say that the economy was not balanced and that people were not having a fair opportunity to live in this nation, that is when the persecution began.
Interesting that the history of the civil rights movement is intertwined with some idealistic Jewish people who marched arm in arm with your uncle, in fact in Selma in 1965, and were persecuted. Some were lynched as well. Tell our audience a little of how you see the relationship between the Jewish community back then and today.
We were very blessed to have the support of the Jewish community. My father, Uncle ML's, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother, was one of the administrators, one of the organizers of the movement. And one of his responsibilities was to get the support, the prayers, and the finances from various members of the communities of America. And the Jews, of course, having had a very strong understanding of persecution, and that would have been religious persecution, not skin color at that time, came alongside. And some of my Uncle Martin's, Uncle ML, I called him, some of his chief advisors were from the Jewish faith.
How very interesting. A question I have to ask you is how you view the illegitimate persecution by government against Dr. Martin Luther King. Throughout his career, he was arrested, put in jail, even his lawyers were audited by the IRS. How do you explain today this persecution of your father and all that he represents?
Well, my uncle, ML, my father, his brother, suffered having taps, wiretaps. Every conversation was recorded, hounded by the IRS, of course, and often jailed and having had to suffer just almost terroristic tactics because they dared to speak against a system that was corrupt. Well, we were living then in what would have been considered the industrial time. We had not come into the technology world that we have today. And so after post-slavery, then blacks were supposed to still be the workers, those who stayed in a lower class. And my uncle had the nerve to say what he had been taught by his father and his mother, that you are a man and you're entitled to the same rights that any American is entitled to. And it wasn't good enough because in many instances, a man like Martin Luther King Jr., who was educated and could have lived a pretty nice life if he had not chosen to obey God and to lead the civil rights movement, he could have made enough money and made his family very comfortable and looked the other way. But he had a strong principle that said, as long as any of my people are suffering, we are all suffering. And I will not live in comfort and ease when my people are suffering. And he was persecuted for that and really meant to be an example. He was made an example because what we saw in the Negro communities, as we were called in the 50s and 60s, was young men who should have been honored being drugged through the streets, thrown into paddy wagons, having their homes bombed, beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And so he was meant to be an example and to say that if you keep this up, this will happen to you.
Absolutely atrocious. Tell us about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and how that organization was also persecuted and hounded.
Well, my uncle, Martin Luther King Jr., was the founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And that happened after, right around the time in Montgomery, Alabama, when a woman, a very valiant woman, Rosa Parks, and she was a seamstress. She sewed garments for people for a living. And she was also involved in an organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which Martin Luther King Sr., Martin Luther King Jr.'s dad, A.D. King's, my dad's dad, was one of the co-founders of that organization in the South. So Mrs. Parks was already a member of the civil rights community working with the NAACP. In Montgomery, Alabama, there was a bus boycott, and the public transportation was such that if you were a Negro then, or what we would call an African-American person today, if you got on the bus and a Caucasian person wanted your seat, you would have to get up and sit in the back of the bus or stand up. So this particular day, Mrs. Parks had boarded the bus. Someone says, "How are you letting colored sit here in this seat?" And the driver says, "You must get up." And she says, "No, I'm not getting up. My feet are tired." So people thought she meant her feet were sore and tired from having worked and walked, but her feet were tired from the persecution of her people. She refused to get up. And so that led the community to outcry. The Negro community said, "No, this is terrible. What are we going to do?" And they said, "Oh, there's a new preacher in town, Martin Luther King Jr., and they asked this young Baptist preacher to help with the organization. And that is the formal beginning of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Out of that came an organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded by my uncle, ML. And the principles of that were founded on the Judeo-Christian version and values that all people should be able to operate in love and faith and forgiveness. He modeled that principle as they started that organization on the methods of Mahatma Gandhi, but the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so the Baptist preachers began to join first, and then the preachers from the other communities, the Negro preachers. There was some Caucasian preachers of good conscience. For example, Dr. Billy Graham, who has been in two centuries, the 19th century and the 20th century, as a strong Christian voice. He called Martin Luther King Jr. up to Madison Square Garden in New York, and that was in the late 50s, and he says, "I'm tired of doing segregated church meetings. I don't want to do anymore. I'm going to call this young man, Martin Luther King Jr., to come and stand with me." And so they began a friendship throughout Dr. King's life.
Wonderful and outstanding that is. How do you see the current relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community? How much progress have we made?
I have actually been to Israel, and I met with many people of the Jewish community there, and I just felt a common bond, knowing that here is a whole nation of people, the Jewish faith, who has been persecuted throughout modern history and even into Bible history if you look at the Old Testament. And now they are very aware of our issues here in the United States. And so I feel that there is definitely a bond between the Jewish community and the struggle against that persecution and the African American community today.
Genocide was perpetrated against Jewish people in World War II, but genocide is being perpetrated right now also. In fact, Christians throughout the Middle East are being slaughtered by terrorists. What are your thoughts with regard to the complacency of the world community in ignoring the plight of Christians and the desecration of churches throughout the Middle East?
One thing I do not understand, and then I guess I do understand it if I really go back into Bible history at the time of Abraham, who had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And of course from Isaac came the strong Hebrew and Jewish faith. And then later we were to understand that not only was Isaac that child of the promise and the strength of the Jewish religion, but now we have Christians, and perhaps this would be very controversial for me to say, but then even the Muslim community. Now what is very sad, sometimes the Muslims are now accepting Christ, and they're being persecuted as well and killed. And so I believe the persecution against the Jews themselves, I firmly believe the Bible. And my pastor, who died October 10th, 2015, often would say, if you come against Israel, you're really coming against God. You can't do that. And I have believed that for many, many years, and I believed it more when I actually went to Israel. So I believe that the answer to the problems of the world will come when we learn to just love people as human beings. And we should never disregard the very special relationship that God has with Israel that cannot be denied. It's very real.
Absolutely, I do agree, of course. Tell us of your activities at the present time.
In the 21st century, I'm a grandmother. I'm a mother. I do what is called here in the United States pro-life ministry. I uphold the sanctity of all human life from conception until natural death. I believe that you should not kill babies in the womb, or you should not kill sick people, elderly people, or poor people. That is why I'm very excited to receive this book, Pharmacracy. I think it's a very intriguing title, because now in the United States especially, the medical world that should have been designed to help people be healed is exploiting our populations. And I think that that is one of my battles as well, to let people know that corruption can take many, many forms. And I'm also an evangelist. I'm a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I must say, what you're doing throughout your life as part of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King is outstanding.
Thank you.
And I'm very impressed. Our audience, I'm sure, is as well. God bless you. Thank you so much for being with us here. Good Lord, it's 2 a.m.
Yeah.
and you made the effort of waiting up all of this time. Thank you so very much.
God bless you. Okay.
I'll be right back.
Human studies are now ready to begin to confirm meaningful reversal of pathological aging processes. These clinical trials aim to alter older humans so that they function as much younger individuals. Even modest success will result in a paradigm shift that will impart enormous societal benefits, such as sparing Medicare from insolvency. Life extension is not standing idle while 5,000 Americans die each day from age-related illnesses.
This concludes our special program on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm Richard Peritz. Thank you for being with us.